So firstly, I want to say thank you. It's been an honour following all of you lovely people, and I know we've got lots more to come. My story today focuses on the transgenerational gifts from my mother. The gifts that go beyond. So being raised by a deaf mum and a hearing father has gifted me with so much. A few years ago, someone asked me about my mother, and I described her in the following way. My mother is profoundly deaf, and she is psychologically hearing. By this, I mean she has failed to embrace her deafness. She never once, or she only once declared that she was deaf, but she used to nod her head in a timely fashion and respond with appropriate utterances, but only fooling others occasionally and more often than not, but never ever escaping the real truth of her own silent world. As a child, I only remember once she declared her deafness, and this was a heartbreaking memory, still is for me to this day, as she said, "I'm deaf," to the person in front of her. The response was, "Oh, I am very sorry, I didn't know." The pain and the anguish in my mother's eyes and in the whole of her body was there before me to see. I experienced her shame and anger, a vision I've never forgotten. However, her tenacity to pretend to be hearing for so long is kind of impressive, really, isn't it? Hold on to this tenacity, it comes through, it comes back round again. Nonetheless, regardless of her lack of acceptance, she was and still is deaf. On the plus side, her deafness made her highly attuned to the world of the nonverbal. Her observation skills are second to none. A skill I really wish she didn't have when I was trying to hide things from her in my teenage years. Her lip reading skills are incredible, but beneath that, her lack of felt sense of belonging, her burden of shame, her lack of acceptance, and her inability to embrace all that she was are cumbersome concerns that she carried for many, many years. Let's just stay with the obvious positive gifts for a while. My mum's deafness supported me to become highly attuned to body language and interpreting facial expressions with a high degree of accuracy. These are forms of communication that tell us so much about how others are feeling and what they are experiencing. How we and those around us use our bodies to convey so much in terms of communication. How even the tiniest of movements can expand our knowledge to identify any incongruence between the spoken and non-spoken language. A skill that assists me every single day. Now, let's think about the gift of shame and an inability to accept. These things featured for me most dominantly in my teenage years. They were burdensome for me back then and really, really tough and in many ways soul-destroying. But that's definitely a story for another presentation. Fortunately, I still had the gift of tenacity. Now, we already know, I've told you before, that my mother had oodles of tenacity, but what you don't know yet is that my father had it too. That's a double whammy dose for me. So when I was in my early 20s, with the driving force of tenacity behind me, I decided to embrace all that was me. I began to connect with my deaf history. I embraced all that is deaf, and I began my journey into deafhood. My first undergraduate degree was in deaf studies and sign language interpreting. Every lecture, every tutorial, and every moment of the 35 hours a week contact time was spent in sign language. We were told to zip it and unzip it because signing was the only way to talk. I was totally immersed in a deaf world, and I couldn't wait to share this learning with my mum. I signed with her, as I knew that she would gather more information if I used my voice, and I signed at the same time. Through my acceptance and compassion for all matters deaf, she slowly but surely began to embrace her own deafness. Deafness was not an issue for me. I creatively adjusted my psychological perspective, and this appeared to support my mum to make her own creative fine-tuning. Remember the tenacity. With a tenacious wind in my sails, I decided to go further in my search, but this time to embrace shame, belonging, and acceptance. There was only one way forward for me. That was 8 years of psychotherapy. I was fed up with carrying the oppressive gifts and allowing them to get in my way. My psychotherapeutic journey gave me the courage and the strength to undertake training in the field. I shared with my mother not only matters discovered about my own journey, but I also shared with her psychological concepts to aid her further on her own journey. My mother is now more fully able to embrace herself and her deafness. What began with my mother's shame, lack of acceptance, her deafness, etc., ends, for now at least, with the capacity to embrace fully who we are and what we bring. The biggest gift of all came in the form of my daughter, Blossom, a special delivery, a precious gift to us. She survived in the midst of many infant losses. A tenacious baby who fought to thrive and survive. My mother's capacity to attune to all that is nonverbal was inherently gifted to me. And so when Blossom was born, I was able to attune to her in this way too. But perhaps this attunement carried less shame, more confidence, more unwavering self-belief, and bucket loads of tenacity. When Blossom was born, I instinctively noticed patterns in her communication, a series of non-verbal cues and clues which held meaning. Although I can't remember being an infant, I am certain that my deaf mum had attuned herself to me in this way. I utilised Blossom's non-verbal language and her baby-led communication to talk with her and to understand more of the language of infants. The irony here is, I believed all mothers and fathers were doing the same thing. I only realised when I went to a local mother and toddler group and started talking about, hey, how are you getting on with the tongue talking and the reading the body language and the expressions and understanding their movements. I was met with a sea of blank faces. Their non-verbal and verbal expressions showed me so much they didn't know what I was talking about. I was puzzled by their responses, as I just couldn't believe that they didn't seem to get what I was saying. But remember the tenacity, it was firmly and still is fixed in every ounce of my being. My studies and life experience had helped me understand the nature of communication and psychology. My drive to share eventually led to the birth of the Blossom method, a simple 3-step communication system based on observation, mirroring back, and responding to your baby's non-verbal cues and clues and connecting them in their communication. The Blossom method is now a communication tool used by parents across the globe, and one being taught in relation to attachment theory. As exciting as this is, and it really is, what fills me with joy is how the gifts of my mother's deafness and shame have been transformed to encourage infants and their parents to communicate even more effectively and may go some way to breaking negative parenting cycles. Thank you, Mum, for all of your gifts. If I can get through this without shedding a tear, it will be a miracle. I'm not sure I can. I wanted to sign this bit, really. From our shame came self-worth and self-respect. From our lack of acceptance came our acceptance of ourselves. And from our lack of felt sense of belonging came a real, true sense of belonging. And from our deafness, oh yes, I was diagnosed with hearing loss in 2012, came a significant understanding of the world of the non-verbal. And from your tenacity, Mum, came even more steely determination. Being mindful of all of the gifts bestowed upon us by our parents and the gifts you are imparting to your children brings many possibilities. I urge you to look at these gifts and their possibilities. Thank you for connecting with this presentation.